so much for having us tonight. I am always excited to appear with Ed. Just a little bit about our friendship. We first met over email in 1999 when I was actually living in Taiwan on a Fulbright fellowship, and Ed was traveling through China, the first of many trips that he would make to retrace his father's army travels. I'm very envious of Ed because I've always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. At the time, I was working at an English language newspaper in Taipei. Fast forward to 2017, Ed and I were both living in Washington, D.C. in Adams Morgan, which I did not know, but I happened to run into him at a mutual friend's party of old China hands. And my son happened to recognize his daughter because they went to the same school at the time. And that's how we discovered we were neighbors. Um, Ed and I had talked about his book right before the start of the pandemic when he was about to go on book leave, the worst time to go on book leave because there's no childcare. And so, Ed, I was hoping you could ground the audience in how you were inspired to write your book, and you could kick us off with a slideshow. Thanks, Ed.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Tracy, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm especially delighted to be talking with the OPC because, as Sandra mentioned, I got a scholarship from OPC when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and in some ways, it was one of the seeds that was planted for my career later as a foreign correspondent and as a diplomatic correspondent. So I have a lot of affinity for the OPC and for the people associated with it. I've been to its headquarters in New York for various panels and events throughout my career. So thank you very much. And thanks, Tracy, for that introduction. So, when I thought about the end of my time in China for the New York Times, I had been stationed there from around 2008, right before the Olympic Games. The Beijing Olympics came to Beijing, which was sort of the coming out party for China, to the end of 2016, midway through the first term of Xi Jinping, the current leader of China. I thought I wanted to somehow do write a piece of work that would summarize my thoughts on China, on my ideas on where it had come as modern day China, as communist ruled China, and where it might be going. And it would wrap in my reporting from my nearly decade there. And I thought I also wanted to make sure that it had the right contextual history in it, because I think that China is a very difficult place to understand if you don't have at least some of the contemporary history. And in this case, mainly from the Mao era onward. And as we know, Mao took over China in 1949. It is now, I think it's safe to say China is the most successful authoritarian country in the world, in that the same party has ruled China for all these decades, and it has ruled it in a manner which has allowed China to ascend to superpower status. And many of the people who live in China now feel fairly, nationalistic or patriotic about the country. So then I thought, what's a good way of writing a book that captures a lot of this? And I thought writing a book that would have strong central characters and a very personal angle might be able to pull the average reader, the lay reader, along through a narrative about China and Chinese history. And I thought that my father's story of his time in the People's Liberation Army could be a good way of channeling the history of China during the Mao era and some of these ideas of China as an empire, which I'd formed during my time there. And then at the same time would tell a parallel history of my time in China from 2008 onward. So I set out to write that book starting in 2018 after I moved back to the US. And then it took me 6 years to complete that project. What I'll do now is I'll run through a short slideshow that will help me tell you the story of that Mao era history of China when my father was in the army. And then we can talk more with Tracy and with all of you about some of the other issues and themes in the book. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'll run through this slideshow with you. And then we can talk more afterwards. So, all right. All right. So this is the book that I came out with in June, At the Edge of Empire. The theme of the book, Empire, is right there in the title. And it's also about the conception of frontiers around China and how those define China. They don't just define China in a marginal way, but they're essential to China's conception of itself, at least in the guise of the Communist Party. So this is my family. This is us at Mount Vernon, Alexandria, George Washington's home. It's a very American photo, and this is us growing up, my sister and I growing up in Alexandria. There's my dad and my mom. And during my time growing up, this is how I saw my dad. He would put on this uniform every day to go work in a restaurant in Alexandria, a restaurant called Sampan Cafe, a Chinese restaurant. And he would go there 6 days a week, working very long hours. I barely saw him when he came home late at night. I knew that his job was tough. And I didn't really know much about his background in China until I was in my 20s, when at one point I decided I would sit down in my childhood home with my parents over several nights and interview them about their past in China. And I had gotten interested in China because I'd started studying more about the history, the politics, the society in graduate school at UC Berkeley. And so my dad then placed this photograph in the palm of my hand, and it's a photo of him in a People's Liberation Army uniform taken in 1953 in China. It's one of two surviving photos of him in this army uniform. And so this is the first sense I had of this whole other life that he had led at one point in his early adult years, well before he came to the US, and something that I knew nothing about. And so I began learning more about that as I interviewed him. And then when I came back in 2018 and decided to undertake this book project, I went much deeper into those questions that I asked him earlier and found out a lot more about his life. And so he was born in the British colony of Hong Kong in 1932, and there he is with his older brother, Sam, 4 years older than him. And they grew up in Hong Kong. They were the children of a merchant family, a Cantonese family from southern China that had moved to Hong Kong, and their father sold herbal medicine, imported herbs from China to the British colonies, sold herbal medicine from a shop in Hong Kong and then to Southeast Asia. So his father was very much a sort of bourgeois capitalist, and he grew up in that family, middle to upper middle class. And then the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong interrupted everything. That took place in 1941, just hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had already set out to wage war on China, and now was trying to take over much of Asia. So it invaded Hong Kong in December 1941. My grandparents then sent my father and his brother Sam and a few other people to their ancestral county, Taishan County in China, to seek shelter there because they thought that they might be safer in the Chinese countryside than in Hong Kong under Japanese occupation. And so they went to Taishan County, did various forms of schooling there, and then went to high school in Guangzhou, the provincial capital of Guangdong province. And that's where my father went to a prestigious boarding school. Here's a photo of him with cousins and schoolmates at a swimming pool in Guangzhou. He often liked to go swimming. And then the Japanese lost the war because of the atomic bombs that America dropped on Japan. But the Chinese Civil War between the communists and the nationalists reignited after the defeat of the Japanese. And then my father heard about the march onward of the communists as they began taking over more and more parts of northern China. And he also began hearing about the communist ideology, how the communists would bring a more equitable society into being in China, how they would get rid of the corruption of the nationalists, how they would stabilize the economy, and how they would industrialize China to put it on par with America and Britain and other world powers. So he started falling under, I think, the spell of the rhetoric of the communists in his late high school years. And then the communists win the Civil War. Mao raises the flag of the People's Republic of China in 1949 in Beijing. My father at that time is here in Guangzhou, graduating from high school in his final year. So in 1950, he is in the first class of graduates from his school and from every other school across China to enter a China ruled by the Communist Party. And at that time, he decides he's going to go to university in Beijing in order to become part of the communist revolution and help the communists realize this vision of China. His brother, Sam, who's 4 years older, decides to take the opposite course. His brother has already graduated from high school, and he decides to accept a scholarship from the US government to come here to America to study engineering. And he he takes a ship to San Francisco and then ends up in Washington, D.C., where he studies engineering at George Washington University. But my father instead goes northward to Beijing. And here's a map of China. As you can see down there in the south, you see Hong Kong, Guangzhou. And he goes all the way up to the far north in Beijing by the Great Wall. Just as a side note, this map is made by the same map maker, Jeffrey Ward, who did the maps for the Game of Thrones books that George R. Martin wrote. So it's kind of a cool map. I think it's the first one he's done of China. Anyway, so my father goes up to Beijing for university. On the first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, he marches in Tiananmen Square with soldiers, students, factory workers, and above them in the stands is Mao, and there are other Chinese leaders up there waving down to them. And then a few weeks later, my father drops out of university to enroll in the military because at this time, the Korean War has been raging for a few months, and Mao has ordered Chinese troops to go into the Korean Peninsula to help the North Koreans fight off the American forces. And my father believes that it's his mission to help defend China and North Korea against the Americans. So he joins the military, gets put in the Air Force. He goes up to Northeast China, and there on the map, you see North Korea up there in the Northeast, and you see the cities of Changchun and Harbin right above North Korea near Russia, and that's where he trained for the Air Force. But then a few weeks into his training in Harbin, in the second Air Force Academy he's placed in, he is told he will not be going to the Korean Peninsula. He'll be put into an army unit instead that goes to the far northwest of China, to a place called Xinjiang. And there on the map, if you go over to the left side of the map, you'll see this area called Xinjiang in the far northwest near Kazakhstan and Russia and Mongolia. And so he gets on board a series of trucks, army trucks, and a train, and they go far out to the west, past the western end of the Great Wall and into this vast area of deserts, of mountain valleys, of snow peaks, of forests. And it's essentially Central Asia. And there he is part of the army, and he takes part in essentially controlling that area, Xinjiang, where many Kazakh Muslims and Uyghur Muslims live. And some of you might know a little bit about the recent history of Xinjiang because the repression of the Uyghurs by the Chinese government has been very much in the headlines in recent years with a system of internment camps, high-tech surveillance, and other measures that the government has imposed on the region. So my father was placed in these different postings in Xinjiang, which is a very remote area. And here you see a photo from a trip that I took to Xinjiang in 2014 when I was trying to trace my father's footsteps and trying to figure out what his army unit had been doing out there. And this is what the area looks like now. It's still an area with, very much an agricultural tradition. This woman here is a Kazakh herder, and there's still many Kazakh herders. They don't live a fully nomadic life like they used to. The party eventually put many of them into these settlements, but in the summer, they still herd livestock. And my father engaged in some of that while he was out there in the army. And in my father's final posting, in his 6 years there, he was sent to a place called Wenchuan, the most remote place that he was posted. And this is a photo of Wenchuan in contemporary times. It's an area that's very close to Kazakhstan. And he was put into a military agricultural garrison there that was the first, among the first of many of these garrisons that would later spread across Xinjiang and be very integral to communist control of the region. These were these farming garrisons that were staffed by units that were associated with the army. And so he was there along with Kazakh soldiers herding livestock in that garrison near the Kazakhstan border. And then in 1957, Mao and other leaders asked young people who had cut short their education to take tests to try and re-enter university because he needed more talent to help industrialize China. So my father saw this as a chance for him to get back into interior China. And so he takes an exam, gets into university in Xi'an, which is in the northwest of Beijing, and he studies aeronautics engineering there. And here's him on a break from university in Beijing with a cousin. But then several things happen in the late 1950s that make him decide to leave China. The first is while he was out in Xinjiang, he had won the trust of military officials out there who said they would sponsor him for membership in the Communist Party. And so he was very eager to win membership in the party. But when he was in Xi'an, he was approached by officials who said that they were going, not only would they put on hold his application, but they would have to investigate him and his family because he came from Hong Kong and his brother had gone off to America. And so they needed to investigate his family and himself for potential subversion of China. And so he knew that something was wrong here, that he had put in all those years in the frontier and the party didn't trust him. Around the same time, Mao also started the Great Leap Forward, which was an industrialization plan. And that ended with this, the worst man-made famine in contemporary history, this famine that ended up killing 30 to 40 million Chinese. And my father and his classmates survived that on their campus. But as you can see, my father emerged very emaciated from that. Here is him in around 1961 after the famine. And he fell ill during that famine, could barely get out of bed. And so he saw that where the policies of Mao were leading. And so he decided to make an escape to Hong Kong. And he went back down to southern China, called in favors from family friends. And one of them was a police officer who owed his family a favor. And the police officer got him this document, this travel document that he would use to leave China for the Portuguese colony of Macau, which is right down there in the south near Hong Kong. And so he went to Macau, and then a few months later, he made it out of Macau to Hong Kong, his birthplace. And he never looked back and wondered about that decision to leave. And in 1967, a few years after re-entering Hong Kong, he goes with his grandmother, flies to Washington, D.C., to America to immigrate there and join his brother Sam. And here is the family celebrating the grandmother's 90th birthday at a restaurant, Jade Palace in Chinatown, Washington, which is where I was born a few years after this in 1971, after my father had met my mother. And so they move out to Alexandria, the suburbs, which is where I grew up. That's us in our childhood home where my parents still live. And then my father didn't go back to China until 1999 when he went on a short tour with my mother and my sister while I was in grad school. He had retired from restaurant work by then. And then he returned to China again in 2008, in 2009, actually, when I got married. And at that time, I had been posted to China to work in the Beijing bureau for the New York Times. And then he returned again in 2012 when my daughter was born in China. And so that was his last trip to China to visit me. And then I continued working in China for 4 years beyond that until 2016 when I moved back here to the US and then eventually to Washington. So his story comes full circle when he comes to see me in China, and we make several trips around China in 2012, including to Guangdong province, to visit some of his old haunts and see some of his old high school classmates at the same time that Xi Jinping has just taken power and is making his own tour of Guangdong province to signal the policies that he will implement in China. And we can talk more about that later in this discussion. But that's essentially the story of my father and how, I was essentially became his proxy for his encounter with the People's Republic after he left, went to exile, and then I went back in a way in his place to continue that engagement with China, but on my own terms. So thanks a lot for listening to me in the slideshow, and then I'll be glad to speak some more, Tracy, and then we can talk more with all of you also.